Welcome to the Everything Financial radio program. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen. We are here every week at this time. Glad you decided to tune in today. I have a terrific show lined up for you. Joining me once again on today's program, one of my favorite guests, Dr. A. Gary Shilling. Dr. Shilling's most recent book, The Age of Deleveraging, is must-reading. You probably also read Gary's long-running Forbes column. If you read Forbes magazine, he has been a contributing columnist to Forbes for over 30 years. So very glad to have him on the program. We'll get his take on U.S. tax policy. What direction are taxes heading? And we'll get his economic forecast. Also, in the second segment of today's program, how can it be that worldwide there is a huge disparity in housing? If you go to Spain, the number of mortgages year over year are down over 40%. And yet here in the United States, there's markets like Nevada where we've seen 25% increases in the price of homes. How can that be, and where is the real estate market headed, and what does it mean for your real estate that you own? Should you be buying? Should you be selling? We'll be talking about that. And also on the last segment of today's program, we'll ask, are stocks in a bubble? If you take a look at price-earnings ratios, if you take a look at what a lot of pundits are saying and have said at similar points in history, I think you'll find the discussion to be very interesting and, more importantly, what it might mean for you and your money. So we'll talk about that in the last segment of today's program as well. So a lot to cover. I want to remind you that if you would like to go back and listen to any of the interviews that we have with the guest experts here on the Everything Financial radio program, you can do that by going to everythingfinancialradio.com, or you can go to the iTunes store and search under Everything Financial Radio and simply download any of the interviews as a podcast and listen to it on your own time. Also, I regret to inform you that the September New Retirement Rules class, where we talk about current economic conditions and what it might mean for you and your retirement, and we do it over 3 nights, is at capacity. However, we are opting to do an October class that will begin October the 3rd. The class will go over 3 nights, October 3, 10, and 17. It's 2.5 hours in length each night, 6:30 to 9 p.m. The cost for the class is $49. That covers all handouts and a book that you'll receive as well. You can go to newretirementrules.com to get more information. And also, if you missed it last week, we do have a report on how to maximize your Social Security. That is free, brand new report. All you have to do is go to bestsocialsecurityoptions.com to request that. Best Social Security Options is the website. I am pleased to have back on the program with me one of my favorite guests, Dr. A. Gary Shilling. Dr. Shilling is the author of Insight, a monthly newsletter that I very much look forward to reading. He's also president and founder of A. Gary Shilling and Company, which Dr. Shilling founded back in 1978. His latest book, The Age of Deleveraging, is a must-read, and he has a tremendous forecasting track record. And, again, a great pleasure to have him back on the program today. So, Gary, welcome.
Thanks. Glad to be with you.
Gary, in your latest Insight newsletter, you discuss how the invisible hand is at work raising taxes for many Americans. Can you explain to the listeners this invisible hand concept and provide some historical examples?
Well, it's almost like the invisible hand that Adam Smith, in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. He talked about the invisible hand where everybody acts in their own best interest in trying to maximize their income's profits, but it results in competition, which works to the benefit of everybody. Well, this is a different kind of invisible hand, and it's not necessarily beneficial to everybody. It's really with taxes. And if you look at the simple ratio of the tax collections on individuals, these are the income taxes, the taxes you pay on capital gains and so on, and divide that by personal income, and this is income from wages, salaries, rents, interest, dividends, and so on, pension funds, benefits. If you look at that ratio, you find over time, going back to, the 1960s, that the ratio averaged 12.3%. Now, what's interesting about it is every time that it gets above that, you tend to see tax cuts, or they ease up on enforcement, or loopholes open, And when it gets below it, as it did recently with all the economic stimulus and the tax rebates and cuts that were introduced in reaction to the Great Recession, then you see a clamping down on loopholes. You see, for example, tax rates went up for the wealthy at the beginning of the year. We're now seeing much more heavy audits of wealthy people and also small businesses, and the IRS has tooled up a division to do this. And another thing is happening is, of course, there's this tremendous chasing of people who had secret accounts in Switzerland and elsewhere who were dodging taxes that way. And this has really opened up Switzerland from what was a very secret place, and it's spread to other countries who are doing the same thing. But what you're seeing is not because of any concerted policy in Washington, but it is this invisible hand. Whenever you get that effective tax rate below that 12.3%, as we did, you start to see a lot of these things that are going to push it up, and now it's almost back to that long-term average.
Gary, I read with a great deal of interest about a conversation, this was in your newsletter, about a conversation you had with a friend of yours who happened to be the ranking Republican on the House Ways and Means Committee back after the 1986 tax cut. And I believe you said you were complimenting him on his good work, and he replied to you, "Don't get too excited, because everything will get more and more complicated from here until it's so burdensome we have another tax reform package." So I thought that was a pretty prophetic statement, given that happened almost 30 years ago.
Yeah, it was. This is Barber Conable. He was a representative from upstate New York. He went on, retired from Congress, went on to be president of the World Bank. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. But he was a great student of how Congress actually functioned, and that actually happened. And he said, look at it, almost everything we do for our constituents involves something to do with the tax code. And so after that, he took me into his inner office, and I talk about this in the newsletter, and he had two of his aides bring in these huge mail bags, each one, they had to drag them, they couldn't even lift them. And he and I sat there opening these letters from his constituents, and they all said the same thing. Paragraph 1, Dear Representative Conable, you're doing a great job in simplifying taxes and dealing with the government deficit and so on and so forth. Paragraph 2, I know you're going to vote for that Rivers and Harbors project in my town. He proved to be very prophetic, because the tax code, it got down to ultimately 2 tax brackets, if you can believe that, when the 86 Tax Act was fully implemented. And now we've got this huge proliferation and the surtaxes and everything else, and of course it's gotten so complicated that now there's a hue and cry for tax reform, but again, it's all cyclical.
Gary, I've always enjoyed your economic forecasts. Let me ask, in your opinion, how is current tax policy affecting the economy?
Well, I think that I think it probably has a negative effect because of, more than anything, the uncertainty of the whole thing. It's uncertainty, and it is the complications and inefficiencies, and of course that's the issue. For example, if you look at the corporate tax now, corporations in this country say we have a 35% maximum tax rate on corporate profits. Well, the effective tax rate is much lower, but it's actually been declining for decades. But the point is that, the marginal rate may be the highest in the world, but when you get through with all the write-offs and special features, loopholes some people call them, the effective rate is much lower. But the point is that when you have these special features, people respond to them. For example, American taxes of foreign earnings of U.S. corporations, multinationals, they're not taxed until they're brought back to this country. Most countries, they only tax on earnings in that particular country. They don't tax on earnings of a say an Irish-based company that are earned in England or Germany or whatever. But we do that. But what this means is that U.S. corporations have huge incentives not to bring that money back to this country. And of course, one of the arguments is well, if they brought it back, then there might be more investment and more jobs created as a result. But they don't, because they have every incentive to keep that money abroad, because as soon as they bring it back, they're going to pay 35% off the top in taxes.
Well, Gary, we are sneaking up on the end of this segment, but I'd like to give the listeners an opportunity to learn more about your work. So if someone's listening to this and they say, I'd like to know more about what Dr. Shilling does, or maybe check out the Insight newsletter, what would you have them do?
Well, I'd suggest that they go to our website, www.GaryShilling, GaryShilling.com. If they're interested in our newsletter, they can call our toll-free number to get further information for subscribing, and that's 1-888-346-7444. 1-888-346-7444.
Terrific. Well, I'd encourage the listeners to check that out, and we will continue our conversation with Dr. Shilling in the next segment when Everything Financial Radio returns. Stay with us.